And it gives me my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Aleksandra Lewicki from the University of Sussex, who will be giving our keynote speech of the day. Dr. Lewicki is a reader in sociology and the co-director of the Sussex European Institute. And her work focuses on investigating boundary making and structural inequalities in post-colonial Europe. As you can see from the title of her talk, I'm sure she will be touching upon some of those ideas. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Lewicki.
Thank you so much, Jana, for the kind introduction, and thank you so much to the organizers of this fascinating event. I've heard amazing papers today, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. Also, fantastic to have my name pronounced. It's a rare occasion, so I'm very grateful. What I want to do today is I want to use this space that I think I've been given, this generous space, to basically narrate one paper to you, which is a slightly dense and intense paper, and so I kind of need that space to evolve it, but I also want to locate it within my wider thinking around race and racialization that I'm working on right now as part of my monograph. So this is sort of one column of the intellectual project, and I want to develop it on the drawing on some empirical data that I've collected as well. So I much look forward to your thoughts. The paper is published, unfortunately, so you can't shape this one, but you can shape my thinking on the subject for the book. How do I click?
Yes.
So where I'm coming from with this paper, what I've sort of had to look into for this paper is the quite vast literature around the recent authoritarian turn and the rise of the far right, and the imprint that this type of mobilization has left on border regimes, the politics of immigration management, which is a huge literature that I'm not even explicitly surveying in this paper, nor will I treat you to a critical discussion of this, because I would have to be very unkind. But I've sort of listed for you some of my frustration with the way in which the authoritarian turn is framed as leaving an imprint on the politics of immigration. So one of the narratives that we get to hear a lot is that we're returning to a new form of ethnocentrism, and that comes along with the closure of borders. That's what a lot of this literature keeps reiterating over and over again. It also observes that part of this recent turn, which we have been seeing, growing in the last 10, 20 years, is a sort of rowing back on globalization and a rowing back on neoliberalism. So that is a critique of a politics that was implemented in the 90s, very often by social democratic governments, that foregrounded neoliberalism in a distinctive kind of way. And so these the frequent reiteration of these diagnoses doesn't make them more convincing. And there are some issues with these recurring observations, which are not, I've not observed these issues, I'm drawing on other people here. So the first issue that arises from this very common diagnosis is that it replicates a distinctive notion of methodological nationalism, because it very much assumes that border making, the politics of immigration management is something that occurs within the silo of the nation state, and that the authoritarian turn is sort of occurring in each nation state by its own. So somebody who looks at Germany is describing the authoritarian turn in Germany and the specific distinctive rise of the AfD. Brexit is explained mainly on national terms as something that occurs within, Britain as a nation state and the political forces that mobilize around this. So this very much overlooks how mobilization against immigration is very much connected across borders, and how bordering evolves increasingly involving corporate actors and involving distinctive ways of reaching out beyond the border, if you want. Secondly, what is quite characteristic of this classical diagnosis is a form of presentism, which accentuates developments in the 1990s that thereby theorize neoliberalism but also globalization in a distinctive way. That very much overlooks that globalization and neoliberalism have much longer trajectories, much longer histories, and need to be traced back to the order of coloniality as distinctive features that were created through colonialism. So obviously globalization first and foremost, but also neoliberalism has got a much longer trajectory in Europe than the 1990s, where it's so often located. So there's a longer durée that's being overlooked in this. Am I still in your camera? Yeah, good. Then, because I'm a mover, so I'll start moving up and down the room in a second. It's very hard for me to contain myself in this spot, but I'll do my best. And the third one is exceptionalism. So there's a bit of a sort of assumption that we're now facing a new form of ethnocentrism, which is distinctively racist. Some observers have even argued there's a return of race to post-Brexit Britain. So you sort of wonder, where has race been in all these years? Has it gone on holiday? And in this sort of diagnosis, we're really overlooking how racist and racial considerations have guided the politics of immigration management in Britain, since the beginning of the politics of immigration management, with the first law that emerged in 1905. So these are my three issues with this literature. And I want to basically revisit some of these questions that have been answered in this unsatisfactory way. And so the wider project that I conducted with some colleagues has raised some of these issues, and I've reframed them for the purposes of this paper, because the project worked with slightly different literatures than I do. So I've sort of appropriated the material, very much in conversation with colleagues, have sort of written this paper. So I think it's worth revisiting this question: who mobilizes politically against immigration, and how are these actors connected with one another? Because I think the sort of classical literature on populism and the authoritarian turn also doesn't really look into the various different milieux that are involved in this type of mobilization. So both connections within the UK are underexplored, but also transnational connections between these countries that face this authoritarian turn. Secondly, what are their demands and political visions? We have a vast amount of internet-based research, quantitative analysis of social media mobilization, and so on, but we actually have very little research that speaks to these people who are voicing these what some people call concerns, what I would call a racist political agenda. And so what are the outcomes of this mobilization? What do they actually produce, right? And what order is created by their means? These are the three questions that the paper addresses. And so this draws on research that I've conducted with a great team of colleagues over the last 4 years. The project was funded in 2020, so we envisaged a longest period of fieldwork, which then occurred online. But that wasn't actually prohibiting us at all. In fact, it was quite conducive to getting quite a wide set of people to talk to us, because everybody had time, everybody was available. And I was really concerned about speaking to these types of actors, but they were, in terms of will they speak to people like me, like just Google me, but they were actually quite happy. They would take any mic that you hold into their face to express their views. And so I have also done only some of these interviews. I've had great help from my colleagues who I'd like to acknowledge at this point: Maddie Clark, my amazing PhD student who's about to complete her PhD on women in the far right. Watch out for this work, it's great stuff. and with because we had the aspiration to not only interview far right actors, which a lot of these studies do, but we acknowledged that the far right agenda has been so mainstreamed by now that you need to really interview across the political spectrum. So we didn't just want to speak to people on the margins, but we interviewed people from Leave Labour on the left, which very much mobilize an anti-immigration agenda, and I had help from Graham Young, who does great PhD research on that issue, so he accessed these kinds of people. Then we spoke to people who and then we also broadened the spectrum, because we were interested. The whole project is called Reaching Out to Close the Border, the transnationalization of anti-immigration movements in Europe. So we very much conceptualize this authoritarian turn as something that is not confined to the sphere of party politics, that is not only advanced by political parties, but uses at this point very different means of mobilizing, which stretch beyond party politics into grassroots movements, street politics, social media influencing, think tank work, knowledge production. So there's a much wider spectrum of repertoires that these actors enact. And we also spoke to people who are basically actively defending the British shore at the Kent coast, so the whole vigilante milieu. And so from this quite, militant militia arm to Leave Labour, we had everyone in this study. And you'd think it would be, would be quite hard, and there would be so many of them. Having done this for 4 years now, I'd say they're actually quite a small group. They're just very loud because the BBC likes to hold a mic into a concerned citizen's face. And we didn't do anything else here. We also held a mic in their face. So I have blinded the sort of responses. They had full anonymity, and I've written the paper in such a way that I'm hoping not to amplify their political claims. This is very often done when they're getting media attention, but it's a critical dissection of what they're saying. So we spoke to people who self-describe as public intellectuals, representatives of think tanks, bloggers, social media influencers, political party representatives. And in this period, while we spoke to them, we also looked at government documents and legislative action. So what was the government doing at the time as these people were pushing and mobilizing their specific agenda? So we sort of traced on, what's happening in this period of 4 years to the immigration regime. And another part of our qualitative data collection beyond these interviews was also we did social media check-ins. I did this so you don't have to. It's really quite depressing if you maintain this at a regular scale. So we didn't just have 23 conversations. I checked into these Twitter profiles sometimes every day. Because then you get quite a good picture of what's happening, and that gives you an overview of online activism, but also people who operate online, and most of them operate in both spheres. But we had a pretty good grasp of who the influential voices were. And our sampling criteria was literally just to engage with people who express quite a vivid opposition to immigration and who have developed a public profile by making this the issue which they mobilize around. So that was the empirical research. But before I tell you what we found, I want to sort of make an offer of how we can theorize this and how we can understand what's going on here. Because we found some surprising patterns, like I was expecting them, for instance, because we started research in 2020, so I was expecting them to speak mainly about people from Syria, who've been displaced from Syria. But at this point already in 2020, the figure of the Eastern European emerged quite strongly from this data. So that was, every other invocation spoke about Eastern Europeans, and there were various things that these Eastern Europeans were doing that were, representing them as a distinctive threat: smuggler, petty criminal, or welfare scrounger, and so on. So that was a surprise to me, and I then wrote a whole paper about just this. But then I thought it's quite problematic to not look into the kinds of hierarchies that are produced by means of these invocations. And then obviously Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened, and at the end of our data collection we also got a bit of that what people say about Ukrainians who are displaced in this milieu. So where I'm coming from in terms of making sense of these invocations is I think we need to think about the longer jure histories of this and the racial order of coloniality, something that very often is conceptualized still within the confines of inclusion, exclusion, nation state, Britishness, non-Britishness, black and white. And I think the literature on coloniality actually gives us a slightly more complex image of how race is constituted through variegated positionalities. And so I find Quijano particularly helpful there. You've mentioned him before exactly in this regard, so I still explain it once again because I think it's quite crucial. So Quijano conceptualizes the racial matrix in such a way that he says, yes, there was a distinction between the colonizer and the colonized that was introduced through colonialism. But what the system of colonial stratification then did, it evolved into various categories and subcategories that also carried material weight. So some people were racialized as European, and that was tied in with property ownership. Then indigenous populations in Latin America were racialized as Indios, again, cutting across a variety of self-descriptions and introducing this unified category, and that was tied to indenture and serfdom. And then people racialized as black were imported from Africa and subjected to slavery. But then obviously this way race becomes tied in with class, because if you have been allocated a specific positionality in the division of labor, then race is the means by which class gets reproduced, because it is then inheritable. If you're racialized as Indio, then you will pass on indenture to your children and children's children. And then it gets even more complicated, because obviously sexual violence is very much part of the colonial endeavor. So then we had these mixed race categories that emerged from this, categorizations such as Mestiza, Creole, which mixed the various groups with one another, which then again translated into a specific position in this racial hierarchy. So race is a lot more complex than just, creating binary distinctions. And then the image gets even more complicated. Manuela Boatka, and her work shows beautifully how the order of coloniality created not only these divisions in the colonies that were subjected to European rule, but also divided Europe into subcategories and subcategorizations, where particularly Britain and France emerged as the sort of heroic Europe that wanted to lead, being racialized as white supremacy, but leading the endeavor against countries that had perhaps initially started some of these colonial projects, but that became relegated to the south of Europe, such as Spain, Portugal. But then, Italy became folded into this, and Greece as well. So we have this sort of lazy southern Europe, but we also have an Eastern Europe, which very often claims a form of white innocence, very much benefited from the colonial endeavor, but is considered to be the lesser Europe. Not fully European, potentially European, always capable of progressing into European standards, but not quite the heroic Europe, not quite the core of things, right? So these complex distinctions, they weren't just created as part of coloniality, they have afterlives. And I think it's quite important to reflect on what the continuities are and what potentially also discontinuities are. A lot of the scholarship in this area, so draws quite similar lines, singular lines of continuity between the sorts of distinctions that were introduced at the global axis. The global axis obviously is the color line. That is one of the most defining axes of race and racism, but there are also older histories, most scholars in this area trace the idea of race back to 1492, where there were yet other substratifications where religion became racialized as a distinctive form of inheritance and so on. So they've created a division of labor that still is maintained to this day, but I think our task is to really look into where do we have continuities and where do we perhaps have discontinuities, because race is a floating signifier, as we all appreciate, right? It is a shapeshifter, it changes shape and form, and so we need to look into the ways in which it manifests itself today. And so I'm very inspired by Anne Stoler's work on colonial durabilities. And she says that colonial durabilities can manifest themselves in the organizing principles of colonial formations. So the way in which specific areas of exclusion are created, but also partial inclusions and sites of privileged exemptions, she describes that as ambiguous forms of governance. So she says colonial endeavors were never just, creating categories of the white and the black, but they created differential substatus to classify people into various subgroups, which obviously makes it a lot harder to resist this type of rule as well. And so this particular mechanism is something that characterizes imperial rule and imperial formations. And Guminda Bambra has argued that that also means we need to analyze states like Britain as an imperial formation that very much reproduce these quite complicated stratifications and status in between. Then obviously we have the work of Gutierrez Rodriguez, Boatka and Benson, who've pointed to the fact that the way in which mobility has been regulated historically has very much contributed to maintaining the order of coloniality. So these divisions of labor are maintained because we have borders that reify these complex stratifications. So Michaela Benson has argued that accordingly, ambiguity by design is inscribed into the post-Brexit border regime. And so my minor contribution to this scholarship that has inspired me is to say, well, the scholarship on borders has been very clear about the fact that borders produce race. But we have heard very little about the fact that if borders produce race, then they produce these various status. That means they produce different forms of racialization. And if we have ambiguous zones of governance, then they produce ambiguous forms of racialization. So in this paper, I argue that ambiguous modes of governance are co-constitutive of more or less ambiguous forms of racialization. In fact, to be entirely true to you, in this paper I suggest that ambiguous modes of governance produce more or less ambiguous forms of racialization, but I think in the broader sense my work is sort of showing that they're co-constitutive, so there's not one direction, but they mutually produce one another. This is part of a wider project of my sort of thinking around the ambiguities of race, or I would even say to think race from its ambiguities, because we tend to fall into the trap of thinking race from the essentialism that it produces, and thereby we overlook how race is very often instrumentally deployed to produce inherent contradiction and status differentials. And this ambiguity is something that I think we need to build into the way in which we think about race. So racism is a lot more than a form of prejudice that just can happen to anyone at any point in time. We need to have a certain stickiness of racialization over the course of history. It's a form of domination that essentializes groups and describes fixed characteristics that become marked as inheritable as part of extractive political purposes. So there's always an agenda behind it, and I think the political economy angle that coloniality gives us allows us to appreciate this instrumentality of race. So I think we can only see race when we appreciate history, geopolitics, and institutional trajectories. So it's not so much about what one person thinks about the other and what happens to people in the shop, right? That's very important, but that's just the experiential end of racialization. I think it's important to trace how race is made in the first place. And so race operates on a multiplicity of axes and is actually a lot more inherently contradictory. And so there are some of these features that I suggest in my current work. So the directionality of race is quite important. As we've heard in the talk before, race can work up or down, right? So we can be racialized as white, we can be racialized as black, as Muslim. I would suggest that you can be racialized as Eastern European, which is slightly different from Western European. It's a stratification of whiteness, but it's a distinctive racialization that carries connotations that are slightly different from being read as Western European. But if we can racialize up and down, then we also need to think about the way in which racialization produces all these positionalities in between, which are very often overlooked in the way in which we think about this. So whenever I present this, I get these kinds of responses where people say to me, yeah, because I'm racialized as mixed race, which is a problematic category, right? And that is something that sometimes I'm folded into whiteness, and sometimes, most of the time, I'm not actually folded into whiteness, but I am put in a hierarchical position in relation to people who are racialized as proper black. So passing is a mechanism that works for various racialized positionalities, and I think we often overlook these hierarchies that race puts us into. These gradations are part of how race works and how it works ambiguously. Race is also relational. We might be read differently in a different context. So there are different histories of racialization in the German context, different histories of racialization in the British context, and these histories matter in how race operates and works. And then it's negotiable, right? So there are some forms of racialization that are inescapable, and when you're visually marked, that is obviously a very different experience that generates. But there are levels of passing that can make some of these forms more or less escapable. And just because racialization is escapable, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't an ongoing extraction of resources going on from this part of the world that is ambiguously racialized. And then I think it's also very important to bring race to the table, to these various hierarchies, because racial categorizations are intertwined and they sometimes reinforce one another. So they're entangled, and sometimes these distinctive racializations can be made invisible. So an example is, for instance, that people who are racialized as Eastern European, that stands very often synonymous for what people, what you may want to call anti-Gypsyism or anti-Gypsy racism or anti-Tsiganism. I've still not found the right term for this phenomenon. I think Romophobia is probably the most criticized one. But the racialization of Roma is very often disguised through a racialization as Eastern European, although Eastern European is obviously a category that is inherently internally stratified as well. So this is the wider political intellectual project behind this. But to take you back to this paper that I'm talking about now, so we have this backdrop, and I suggest in the paper that neoliberalism is the modus operandi that actually helps to implement the order of coloniality. So here I draw on Quinn Slobodian, who's basically been arguing that, at some point when colonialism, decolonial struggles ended formal colonialism, neoliberalism constituted one of those forms that enabled the maintenance of some of the extractive mechanisms that colonialism stood for or enabled. So at the heart of neoliberalism is a world of a post-colonial world order, is a vision of a post-colonial world order in which a political world of borders coexists with a borderless world economy. And I think border studies very often forget that borders are not only closed all the time, but that borders are also being opened for some and closed for others, and that there are loads of positionalities in between. So this mixing of closing borders for some and opening it for others is very much part of the neoliberal rationale, and the state is the tool with which governments do this. So in the neoliberal vision, the state's job is to ensure the unlimited mobility of a global financial elite and its capital, to facilitate a disposable precarious labor mobility through partial openings, and also to regulate threats by restricting other mobilities. And so I suggest that, Slobodian is quite clear about these functions of the state in implementing neoliberalism, but I suggest that what he's not telling us is that these mechanisms basically correspond with distinctive racializations. In the case of the British post-Brexit border regime, that there's specific positionalities that are tied to this. So the mobility of the global elite, these elites are very often racialized as Western European, sometimes also US, Australia, and so on, but there's a distinctive idea as to who is racialized as privileged. The disposable precarious labor mobility is very often racialized as Eastern European, and those whose mobility is to be restricted are people who are racialized as non-European. And so neoliberalism provides not only the underpinnings for this order that it realizes, but neoliberalism also underpins bordering technologies. We've heard a lot about this today. So everyday bordering is fundamentally a neoliberal mechanism, which I think the literature on everyday bordering isn't developing quite as much as it could. But because it's very much outsourcing border controls to private citizens, they take responsibilities that have been formally held by the state and are being responsibilized in that process. But obviously we also see the outsourcing of border controls to global corporate actors, which is also inherently a neoliberal mechanism. So to tell you what that looks like in my data, and to hopefully bring it home as an argument, the first group of people who I want to tell you about, who we interviewed, some of these I actually did myself, are public intellectuals and people who work in think tanks. Some of them are academics at institutions of higher education, although we didn't speak to those. Whenever I put examples there of specific individuals, then we did not speak to them because I blinded my data. But so I would say that the knowledge, the action repertoire that they engage in is a form of knowledge production. It's not always or very rarely actual academic knowledge production what they do. They very much draw on FOI requests, so freedom of information requests, statistics that they pull from the internet. So they're making claims, truth claims about reality that are very eclectic, but they work very much across borders. So this is a group of people who cite each other, invite each other to events, they translate each other's books, they issue speaking invitations. So the British actors who we spoke to travel to the Netherlands, to Germany, to Denmark, the US. Those were their sort of ties, very much within Western Europe. They engage in, when they do these public events, then they're being put on YouTube. So there's a sort of mutual invitations and appearances. They reinforce each other's views. They said in the interviews as well. So this isn't very much about learning something new. It's about meeting with like-minded people who, share the same kinds of views. They're very well networked across borders, and they have really, really sophisticated access to government. So they self-describe as really far from parliament. What they're doing is really not, parliamentary politics. They self-describe as concerned citizens. They feel very much like on their own, but they actually advise loads of government ministers and have close ties to political parties. So this is a very well-networked milieu to people who then make these decisions. And so I think their main role is in sort of framing a problem and then providing policy solutions. You can find a lot of that in our data. And so they have this tripartite distinction as well. So they also spoke about, people who are racialized as non-European. They feature mostly in their narratives when they cross the English Channel in an inflatable dinghy. And the discourse that was quite prevalent in the data here was a sort of reckless risk-taking. So people risk their lives, which is a reckless, the narrative is that they're somehow endangering others, potentially also border force, and themselves, because they're doing irresponsible things, very much a colonial discourse, right? That would be sort of projecting the need of the state to protect these people from themselves. But they're racialized as Muslim or black. And this is the mobility that definitely has to be constrained, has to be stopped for their own sake so that they don't subject themselves to further harm. Then they also speak about precarious workers from Eastern Europe who are framed as welfare scroungers, who are a fiscal burden, who are part of the problem because they earn so little money that they then extract from the welfare state, which is a total twist of the actual narrative, because obviously if you're precariously employed, then you don't have any access to the welfare state. But who they celebrate are, as one of my respondents said, German and French bankers. They're the ones who make the real contribution when they come to Britain. And so this is the kind of mobility that the post-Brexit border regime really wants to maintain and continue to enable in their narrative. And so you can see that here in Eric Kaufmann's, shall we call it data? So this is a representation of the ethnic composition of London, where you can see he has also this division. White British is the group that is in decline, which is very much a conspiracy theory, replacement conspiracy theory. Then you can see the non-white population is the grey area. But in the middle, we have the white other. So we know these aren't the German and the French bankers, right? So there's very much this sort of scenario of the threats from various directions. Another form of knowledge activism down here is one of the people who we observed regularly on social media posted about the fact that the Wikipedia entry on the invasion of the British Isles has finally been edited to reflect the recent invasion of the British Isles, which is coming via the channel in inflatable dinghies. And so this was obviously instantly taken down. He tweeted this and the tweet was taken down within seconds. So I mean, I don't want to speculate that he put it up there, but he knew about this awfully quickly, right? And this is somebody who works for one of these classical anti-immigration think tanks. So these are just, to give you an idea of the types of action repertoires and forms of activism that they engage in. That's what the government was up to, which is a very crude and selective list of things that the government was up to. But I think it reflects a wider picture of what's going on. So I think what we don't talk about often enough is these visions for privileged mobility, right? So Boris Johnson and the Tory party, who's been in charge over the last 16, how many years? 14, yeah, awful long time. They had this vision for the English coast to become a zone free from tariffs, where investors could be attracted, very much modeled along the image of the City of London, a vision of free ports. But they all themselves also engaged in offshoring their own money, right? So some of the richest representatives of the Tory party, as we've learned from the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and all these investigative journalist accounts, they themselves moved their money abroad, which is very much something that is possible because of legislation that was brought in during colonial times, where governments were trying to protect and ring-fence colonizers' money from taxation. So these visions of where borders are open were part of that program. Then we have this middle zone of the racialization as Eastern European. So the post-Brexit border regime, what it did implement is a regime that very much looks into income levels as a entry requirement, but for those key professions where precarious labor was supposed to continue coming in, visa exemptions were ushered in, and these are classical jobs like seasonal work, which are recruited from the east of Europe, health and social work, construction, and so on. And this list has grown over the last few years to enable basically more disposable but precarious labor migration. The settled and pre-settled status, obviously a very privileged status, right? Because it was given to people who had lived in the UK, who had come as part of free movement within the European Union. But it's a digital status that is being checked by, at any point you apply for welfare or you interact with public authorities, they have to do a status check. If you have had pre-settled status and then you change to settled status, both these files sometimes are still in the system, so there's a lot of confusion around this. And obviously there are checks being conducted as part of the duty of the hostile environment. So people have to make sure that they don't give benefits to someone who is not entitled to them. So the digitalization has been then translated into these everyday bordering practices that distinctively construct a suspect community of this population. And then the Homes for Ukraine scheme. So the amount of times I have heard the Homes for Ukraine scheme contrasted to other forms of asylum is literally, I think it's one of the most commonly brought examples to describe processes of racialization, and I think the image is actually a little bit more complicated. So yes, there was an unprecedented response in Europe. The European Union activated the temporary directive, which it has never done before, which gave people who were displaced from Ukraine unprecedented access to social welfare systems, to an immigration status imminently. But there are also some issues with it. So what happened in the UK is that when Russia invaded Ukraine, the first thing the British government did is shut down all visa representations in Ukraine. So that was, we're not taking any people from there because obviously a lot of people are going to be displaced there now. These visa representations are still shut, by the way. My colleague Nuno, who's sitting there in the back, and I have had a delegation from Ukraine visiting at SEI 2 weeks ago, and they had to travel to Warsaw to get a visa just to do a visit here in the UK. The second thing that happened is Government Minister Kevin Foster announced on Twitter that if Ukrainians want to come to the UK, if they're being displaced to the Russian invasion, that they can apply to the visa scheme as agricultural workers. So that very much shows how people from the east of Europe are imagined as this sort of de facto default precarious workforce, and that they're being tied and associated with these kinds of tasks. As the full-scale invasion happened, search machines all over Europe went off and people started combining the search term sex worker with the term Ukrainian. There's a study that's looking into the disproportionate rise of these types of searches. So the sort of reservoir of cheap labor, Eastern Europe, is very much activated in these imaginaries. So what's happening with the Homes for Ukraine scheme is then the government said, I should maybe say, because Europe showed so much solidarity with Ukraine, the population in Britain said, there's something wrong, why are we not taking anyone? And the government said, no, we're not going to change our whole immigration framework for these people now, but if you're so keen to help a Ukrainian, why don't you invite them into your home? That's basically the rationale of the Homes for Ukraine scheme. You can only get asylum if somebody's prepared to offer their spare room to you. So can you see how this is a deeply neoliberalized refashioning of the idea of asylum, because you are reliant on a private citizen to offer you their spare room so you can claim asylum. This isn't state-based asylum. This isn't at all the same construction. This is a privatization of asylum for some people who obviously they're racialized as white. I think they're racialized as partially European, but as white, so there might be a greater willingness to offer spare rooms to them. But this isn't state asylum because the temporary status at some point also expires, and then we have seen that recently a lot of people displaced from Ukraine are basically homeless, because if the arrangement with their private host is no longer there, then the state system doesn't kick in. And we're seeing similar patterns in Germany and in other contexts where there isn't a Homes for Ukraine scheme in place, but the temporary status creates a lot of rupture and problems. So, but we also have to point out that because the Homes for Ukraine scheme was there, people displaced from Ukraine didn't have to cram on inflatable dinghies. There is no, Calais jungle or any equivalent. So this is a partially privileged status, but not a full right to asylum. And so if we're then looking into the measures that have been put in place to contain the mobility of people racialized as non-European, they obviously completely abolished asylum, essentially. So all routes that used to be legal have been illegalized by pieces of legislation over the last few years. I'm not talking about history here because the current government hasn't got any plans of reversing any of this. So it has discontinued the famous Rwanda scheme, right? But that is symbolic politics, really, because they're currently already talking about the same kind of framework of offshoring and forced removal to a third country. It's just going to be a different country than Rwanda because that contract has been discontinued. All the other measures are still in place and they will very much remain in place. So this isn't history. The only legal route into the UK right now is either via resettlement or via a specified humanitarian visa, such as the Homes for Ukraine scheme, for instance, but there are also other humanitarian visa routes that have to obtain before arrival. Anyone who arrives in the UK without obtaining this status prior to arrival has been illegalized. And these legal frameworks have introduced prison sentences for illegal arrivals and for facilitating illegal arrivals. That's essentially the end of asylum, right? None of this has been discontinued, but the current government is smashing the gangs, so is prioritizing the criminalization of facilitation as opposed to the criminalization of, crossing a border. But then I think it's also quite important to consider the way in which private contractors have been brought in this period. So SAR operations, search and rescue, is something that was outsourced for a while to private companies in the Channel. The US-based company Anduril, which has developed watchtowers and surveillance technology for the US-Mexican border, was brought in to build watchtowers along the English coast. And to supply surveillance technology. Obviously, this isn't just learning from this technology, this is also about building a transnational database of people on the move, because once you cross one border, then you have to claim asylum in the first place where you've crossed into. So if there's some record of you having arrived somewhere else, then you're going to be sent back where you've arrived first. But apart from the outsourcing to global corporate actors, There's also a distinctive responsibilization of individual citizens via this Project Kraken here at the bottom. So that is a campaign the previous government launched to alert citizens who live on the coast of England, mainly in Kent, so we didn't see these posters here, but around Kent, Foxton, you could really see these posters hanging, where coastal residents were invited to be vigilant and watchful, and to see whether they see any strange activity on the shore or boats arriving at unusual times, which is very much a sort of activating private citizens to be border guards in a different shape and form, right? We know this from the hostile environment everyday bordering, we know this from the prevent duty, and the coastal population was responsibilized in a distinctive way for this sort of agenda. And so, you know, what then counts as unusual activity? How are you going to identify a suspicious boat? Obviously, that has to be a visual form of recognition. So if you have people racialized as Muslim or black in one of these boats, that's going to be suspicious activity, right? And then I think also important to mention the government was trying to implement a new pushback policy, pushing dinghies back into basically from British waters into French waters is something that is illegal on, you know, on grounds of, shall I name them? Lots of international treaties, the Geneva Convention, any human rights framework, the rights for safety at sea. So there's a gigantic international framework that forbids pushbacks on various grounds. But the British government got as far as rehearsing pushbacks in the English Channel. So an activist group filmed them when they sort of practiced having two jet skis pushing a dinghy along into French waters, which they were hoping to actually implement as a politics of deterrence, but there were loads of legal challenges, I think 4 at the same time, all drawing on these various international frameworks, and they were successful, so the British government had to withdraw the pushback policy. But what you can see here in these 3 types of measures, and again they're crude selection, there are others that I could tell you about, but I think they very much are a combination of a privatization by diffusing borders into both global corporations but also private citizens in an extension of the logic that we've seen before. But they also facilitate distinctive openings, partial privileges, and enact distinctive closures. So, do I have time to tell you about the vigilantes? Yeah? Okay, my chair is over there. So I think this sort of completes the picture quite nicely. So these are people who have self-appointed themselves as defenders of the British shore. They're just a small handful of people who form something what you could call an organized militia, but they obviously don't self-describe like this because they're trying to avoid any organizational ties. They self-describe themselves as, you know, I'm not going to say lone wolves because that's obviously a loaded term, but they self-describe themselves as individuals who are concerned and enact their concern. They do various things such as advocacy and offer shelter for homeless people. Very often they combine this interest in homeless people with a concern for veterans. So one of them runs a shelter for veterans. They harass refugees and staff at hotels, which have been used for a while now as temporary accommodation upon arrivals. And that's something that we saw explode hugely in the far-right riots, right, in the summer, where hotels were specifically targeted. So this was by no means something new. Some of these organizations are sort of building a map of shame where they're sort of, you know, pinpointing hotels that host refugees quite systematically. So this is an action repertoire that they've rehearsed for a long time. They also, because government couldn't do pushback, right, they decided, well, but we can. So some of them crowdfunded, as you can see up here. They put a crowdfunding advert on a website and asked for people to donate towards the migrant hunter boat. You would think that's extremist language, right? But one of the border force vessels that's out on the channel is actually also called Hunter. So, the sort of the proximity between government politics and what they're doing is a lot closer than the literature appreciates. because particularly the board launch with a sort of similar name, but also the idea if government can't do pushbacks, then we can do them, is a bottom-up response that very much takes matters into their own hands and just very gradually extends the government's mandate. Another thing that they do is they're doing what they call spotting. So they patrol the beaches, stand on the coast, and share footage of arrivals on social media, which is very much implementing the hostile environment, if you want, because the hostile environment gives ordinary people the mandate to control illegal immigration. It's also an enforcement of the prevent duty, because the prevent duty asks us to, detect early signs of radicalization. So they are just extending what government asks ordinary citizens to do to another level by doing it all the time in their free time, if you want. So you would think of them as the most sedentary kind of population, right? Because they're usually socioeconomically more disadvantaged than some of the other actors I looked at so far, but even they engage in transnational action repertoires. I was quite surprised to see one of them spends his whole afternoons, when he's done with the filming and the spotting on the beach, he goes home where he connects via social media with similar vigilante activists in Greece and Italy to look at their footage and compare his own footage with the footage of, that these activists have recorded, to basically, again, do a sort of implementation of the mandate he's been given by the state to look into illegalized or illegal arrivals for him. But there was also one of the vigilantes who actually took it upon himself to crowdfund for a flight to Poland. So he took off and flew to visit the border between Poland and Belarus, because, as he said, Poland and Hungary are the saviors of Europe. They're really defending the borders of Europe so much better than our current government is doing this. So there you can see how the racialization as Eastern European is actually quite ambiguous, because it can be used to inferiorize, but it can also be mobilized for purposes of white supremacy and the reinforcement of white supremacy. So that's a real ambiguous positionality, because it can go up and it can go down, right? So this trip wasn't very successful, I'm very sad to report. He didn't get anywhere near the border, which is quite well guarded and cordoned off. But he got on the plane, he filmed that meticulously, he shared that on Twitter. It was Twitter at the time still. And then he left some stickers of his, organization his political claims, because he's obviously not part of an organization, left on some lampposts, and then he filmed himself in the accommodation. So that was, the footage that was then shared with his followers on social media. So I think you've been very patient with me. It's time to wrap up. What we see here in these three types of action repertoires, is this a sole focus on the nation state? Is this a turn away from neoliberalism? And is this a form of ethnocentrism and closed borders? So I would say, maybe, but maybe that's not the whole story, right? So the post-Brexit border regime, I suggest in this paper, is collaboratively produced by a diverse set of actors who work across borders very much. They're very much connected with actors elsewhere. It draws on and implements a neoliberal vision, but also functionality, in that the technologies that they implement, both bottom-up, but also the ones that government use, are neoliberal. It operates both through closures, racialized closures, but also openings of semi-partial privilege and full privilege, and thereby produces privileges and opportunities for those racialized as West European to move freely, while the mobility of those racialized as Eastern European, thereby potentially fully European, is regulated to maximize its extractive value, and those racialized as non-European is severely restricted in the process. So that means I would suggest that state and non-state actors co-produce a neoliberal border regime of stratified rights, partial inclusions, and gradual exclusions, which are very much the logic of imperial formations. These variegated entitlements draw on and reinvigorate the global order of coloniality, and the racial imaginary that's at the heart of this doesn't operate just via binaries that center the nation state, as in British, non-British, but very much produce stratified distinctions that put us in complex relationships to Europeanness. Thank you very much for your attention so late in the day. And if you want to read the paper, which is even more intense and dense than my presentation, it's out in International Political Sociology.